You think last week's college football playoff rankings were playing in the minds of the Georgia Bulldogs on Saturday? The Dogs checking in at number 2 for the second CFP rankings. And what do? They go out and dominate Ole Miss 52-17. Well, the committee heard you loud and clear, Georgia. They return to the top spot in this week's rankings, edging out Ohio State for number 1. They've got a top 25 matchup in the future as they travel to Neyland Stadium for the penultimate regular season game, our SEC game of the week, streaming on Paramount Plus against Tennessee. UGA has won 6 straight against the Vols and could tie the longest winning streak in SEC history with a win on Saturday. So much to talk to with these Dogs. They are back on top, and we welcome in CBS college football analyst Kevin Carter. Kevin, I was going to list some important stats about how well Georgia's played as of late, but we would probably need a couple hours to get through the entire list. So I'm just going to cut to the chase here. How much do they deserve to be in this top spot?
I think now the one thing that the committee has done a good job of is if they've laid breadcrumbs, which means we can trace the steps of how they got to their conclusions. I, for one, was on the bandwagon that Georgia should have never been taken out of that number 1 spot. But you can justify it by the teams, the ranked teams that both, any of those teams that are vying for that top spot have played against. Earlier in the season, Ohio State had beaten Notre Dame, they beat Penn State, but but for Georgia, having overcome Florida and a bitter in-state rival, and then 2 back-to-back ranked SEC wins over Missouri and Ole Miss, that solidifies Georgia and it justifies them being in that number 1 spot. I think that's really what we've been looking at, and I think when you go back, like I said, through the steps of how the College Football Playoff Committee got their rankings, I think now it's easier to trace. So that much I do appreciate, but like I said, I for one would have never taken Georgia out of that number 1 spot, knowing what they have and how they've evolved thus far this season.
2 more games on the regular season schedule, but the one that really matters, Kevin, the rematch we've all been waiting for, Alabama and Georgia back in the SEC championship game. Now, last time out, the Tide lifted that trophy, but Georgia won the ultimate prize of the national championship. So what should we be expecting in this conference title match?
I was on with Brent Stover in studio this past weekend, and he asked me a question about who I thought the most dangerous team to Georgia was, or who Georgia would not want to play. And, obviously Michigan comes to mind, right? Because they're built similarly, and we can't wait to see this matchup of toughness along the line of scrimmage and commitment to the run and defense and everything else. But to me, the program that's really evolved and come forward, and unlike a lot of us experts really anticipated they would, it's just the evolution of Jalen Milroe and this Alabama offense. They didn't double down on their toughness. They haven't committed to running the ball. They're letting Jalen Milroe cook, for lack of a better word. I mean, he's hitting huge plays down the field. They're putting the trust of the offense processing in his hands. They're allowing him to hit these huge chunk plays, responsible for 6 touchdowns this past weekend. I mean, he's playing out of his mind, and this defense is following suit. This offense is following suit in terms of supporting and playing well. I mean, now you're starting to see the strength of what they do from an interior line standpoint up front for Alabama, because you're seeing these edge rushers, Dallas Turner, guys get to the quarterback. You're seeing Chris Braswell get to the quarterback. You're seeing guys making a difference, rushing with 4. We're seeing that patented 5 underneath, 2 deep secondary of Alabama. This Alabama team is really coming forth and playing its best football right now. So you're talking about threats in the SEC. Yeah, this road to the college football playoff going through the SEC is very much alive, and I think it's solidified now, having 2 teams that could easily find themselves winning a national title in Georgia and both Bama, just because of how Alabama has evolved from that loss to Texas earlier this year.
Yeah, I used to cover Alabama, and I learned one thing in my 3 years there: never count out Nick Saban. He's got that edge, obviously. That one kicking off on December 2nd on our CBS platforms. Now, Kevin, before we let you go, let's talk about the next game on the schedule for Georgia. They're facing Tennessee, who checked in at 18 in the latest college football playoff rankings. Now, they haven't had the best of luck against the Dogs in the but they have seen plenty of magic at Neyland Stadium. They're a perfect 5-0 at home this year, but is that really an advantage when you're facing a team that's as dominant as Georgia?
Games are won and lost because of matchups, independently of how they've been necessarily playing and what they've been doing. This is a bad matchup for Tennessee. We saw Tennessee run into a buzzsaw of sorts last weekend when they faced a team that was more committed to running the football and controlling the line of scrimmage in Missouri. Only 83 rush yards compared to 255 rushing yards to that of Cody Schrader and that Missouri rushing attack. They dominated up front, and this is a bad matchup for Tennessee because when you look at that 5-0 record for Tennessee at home at Neyland Stadium, in those matchups they had over 250 yards rushing. I think I was in studio and talking to Rick Neuheisel, and he said it best. There's a formula for this Tennessee team for winning games, and it really consists of them rushing for over 200 yards in the ball game. Whether it's the 2 games prior to last week's loss to Missouri, Kentucky, and UConn, both over 250 yards, or you go back to the 3-game win streak earlier in the season over UTSA, South Carolina, and Texas A&M. Each of those games, they were over 230 rushing yards for the game. And in the games that they haven't, losses to Alabama and Missouri, they had less than 150. So that matchup for this weekend versus them dogs, versus a defense that's still otherworldly despite losing 29 players to the draft, in the last couple of seasons, they're still great, and they're still not going to allow this Tennessee team to get going on the ground. So I think it's a bad matchup, and I think this Georgia team, we were right to spend most of the segment talking about Georgia going to play Alabama because that's really what we're talking about.
Well, I'm going to send my thoughts and prayers to the goalposts there for Tennessee, just in case there's an upset that happens in that game. Kevin, thanks so much. We appreciate your time. Georgia at Tennessee. It's our SEC Game of the Week here on CBS. Tennessee trying to turn the tide and pull out the upset once again. It's happening on CBS, or you can stream it on Paramount+.